The fastest way to destroy a $1 billion company is to laugh at the wrong person in the right room. The laughter rolled across the executive boardroom as Richard Whitmore slowly pulled his hand back and looked at Victoria Brooks as though she had committed some kind of social mistake simply by standing there. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him overlooked downtown Chicago, where the late afternoon sun reflected off steel and glass towers worth more money than most people could imagine. Around the polished conference table sat some of the most influential business leaders in America. Their tailored suits, luxury watches, and carefully practiced smiles projected confidence, power, control. Yet none of them seemed interested in hiding their amusement. Victoria stood at the end of the table, calm and composed in a navy business suit, a leather portfolio resting lightly in her hand. She had arrived exactly on time. She had been formally invited, and she had followed every professional expectation required for the meeting. Richard's eyes moved over her with open dismissal before he glanced toward the other board members. "I think there's been some confusion," he said. "This meeting is for decision-makers." A few chuckles immediately followed. Someone near the middle of the table laughed harder than intended before quickly trying to hide it. Victoria did not react. She simply held Richard's gaze. The silence that followed should have ended the moment. Instead, Richard took another step forward. "No offense," he continued, smiling in a way that made it clear he intended exactly that. "But I prefer to know who I'm doing business with before I start shaking hands." More laughter spread around the room. Several members of the board exchanged knowing looks. One executive leaned back in his chair and folded his arms as though he were watching entertainment rather than a business meeting involving a proposed $12 billion expansion project. Victoria remained perfectly still. She neither defended herself nor challenged him. That seemed to irritate Richard even more. People like Richard Whitmore had spent their entire lives expecting reactions. Anger, embarrassment, apologies. Anything that reassured them they controlled the conversation. Victoria offered none of those things. The room itself reflected Whitmore holding success. Marble walls, custom artwork, imported wood finishes. Every detail designed to remind visitors whose building they occupied. Richard had personally overseen the headquarters renovation 3 years earlier and often referred to it as his greatest achievement. Today he wore that same pride like armor. "Security should really be more careful about guest verification," Richard said casually. "Anyone can walk into a building these days." A few board members laughed again. One woman near the far end of the table lowered her eyes, visibly uncomfortable, but said nothing. No one spoke in Victoria's defense. Not a single person. The silence of observers often carried more weight than the words of aggressors. Victoria slowly set her portfolio on the conference table. "Are we beginning the meeting?" she asked. Her voice was calm, professional, unshaken. The simple question caught several people off guard. Richard blinked once. Then he smiled. "That depends," he replied. "Do you actually belong in this meeting?" The board erupted again. This time the laughter lasted longer. Victoria looked around the room. She studied every face, every reaction, every person willing to participate, every person willing to remain silent. Then she simply nodded once and took a seat. That unexpected response created a brief crack in the room's confidence. Richard noticed it immediately and moved to regain control. "Interesting," he said as he returned to his chair at the head of the table. "Well, this should be entertaining." Around the table, laptops opened. Presentation screens illuminated. Assistants quietly distributed briefing packets. Outside the windows, the Chicago skyline began to glow beneath the fading sunlight. Inside the room, confidence remained high. After all, Whitmore Holdings was hours away from final approval on the largest corporate expansion deal in company history. Everyone believed they knew exactly how the evening would end. Everyone except Victoria Brooks. And as the first presentation slide appeared on the giant screen behind Richard, a single notification quietly lit up on a phone halfway down the table, causing one board member's confident smile to disappear for the first time that day. The notification disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, but Charles Bennett could not ignore what he had seen. His eyes lingered on the screen for a fraction too long before he quickly locked the phone and slid it beneath a folder. Across the table, Richard Whitmore was already launching into the presentation, completely unaware of the subtle shift that had just occurred. The giant display behind him illuminated with projected revenue charts, market forecasts, and glossy renderings of future developments stretching across several states. This expansion was supposed to redefine Whitmore Holdings for the next decade. Every executive in the room knew it. Every board member had spent months preparing for this day. Richard paced confidently near the screen, speaking with the smooth certainty of a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. The acquisition gives us access to more than 3 million square feet of premium commercial property, he said. Once finalized, we become the dominant player in every major market east of the Mississippi. Heads nodded around the table. Several executives smiled. The numbers were impressive. The opportunity seemed unstoppable. Victoria sat quietly, reviewing documents from her portfolio without appearing particularly interested in the presentation. Richard noticed. His expression tightened slightly. Of course, he continued, glancing toward her. Certain people may not fully understand the scale of what we are discussing today. A few board members laughed again. Not as loudly as before. Not as confidently. Victoria simply turned a page. Her calmness was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Richard returned to the front of the room and clicked to the next slide. Funding commitments have already been secured, he announced. Every major partner has confirmed support. There is virtually no scenario where this deal fails. Charles Bennett felt his stomach tighten. He looked down at his phone again. The message remained there. Short, direct, urgent. He reread it for the third time. Then the fourth. Finally, he raised his eyes toward Victoria. She was still reading, still silent, still composed. For reasons he could not explain, that worried him more than anything. Charles. Richard's voice snapped across the room. You seem distracted. Several people turned toward him. Charles forced a smile. Just reviewing some numbers. Good, Richard replied. Because by tomorrow morning this company will be larger than it has ever been. The board offered polite applause. Richard accepted it like a man receiving an award. Beside Charles, Susan Crawford leaned closer. What was that message? She whispered. Charles hesitated. Probably nothing. But his voice lacked conviction. Susan noticed immediately. Before she could press further, the boardroom doors opened, and an assistant entered carrying a stack of folders. She distributed them quickly around the table. Updated financial summaries, she explained before leaving. Richard barely glanced at his copy. Everything has already been reviewed, he said. This is merely procedural. Victoria finally looked up. Procedures exist for a reason. The room grew quiet. Richard smiled. And now you are offering governance advice? No, Victoria replied calmly. I am offering a reminder. The exchange lasted only seconds, but something about it unsettled several people in the room. Her confidence did not match the role Richard seemed determined to assign her. She spoke like someone who belonged there, someone who expected to be heard. Richard clicked forward again. New projections filled the screen. Future revenue, future growth, future dominance. Yet while he spoke, more phones began vibrating around the table. One executive checked an email. Another glanced at a text message. A third quietly opened a financial alert. Their expressions changed one by one. Small changes, barely noticeable, but Victoria noticed. She noticed everything. Richard continued speaking without interruption, unaware that attention was slowly drifting away from him. Susan finally opened the email that had arrived moments earlier. Her eyes widened. She immediately looked toward Charles. He gave a nearly invisible nod. The same email, the same concern, the same name appearing where no one expected it. Victoria Brooks. Susan swallowed hard. Across the room, Richard was still describing a future he believed was guaranteed. But for the first time all afternoon, several members of the board were no longer looking at him. They were looking at Victoria, and none of them liked the questions beginning to form in their minds. Richard Whitmore enjoyed being the smartest person in the room. At least that was what everyone had been trained to believe. For years, executives had nodded when he spoke, investors had praised his instincts, and business magazines had celebrated his leadership as if it were beyond question. But as the presentation continued, the atmosphere inside the boardroom began to change in ways he could not yet see. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was becoming strained. Several board members were no longer focused on the numbers flashing across the giant screen. Instead, they kept glancing down at documents, emails, and messages arriving from sources they trusted. Susan Crawford adjusted her glasses and opened the attachment that had appeared moments earlier. The file contained a summary prepared by outside counsel. She scanned the first page once, then twice. Her heartbeat accelerated. Across the table, Mark Holloway received the same report. His expression immediately hardened. He looked toward Victoria Brooks and then back toward the file. None of it made sense. Or rather, it made too much sense. Richard continued speaking. By this time next quarter, our market position will be untouchable. Competitors will be forced to follow our lead. The financing structure alone gives us advantages nobody else can match. Victoria slowly closed her portfolio. The sound was quiet, but somehow several people noticed it. Richard noticed it too. Something amusing? He asked. Victoria folded her hands on the table. Not at all. Good, Richard replied. Because this deal requires serious business experience. A few scattered laughs followed, but the response was weaker than before. Richard frowned slightly. Earlier, every insult had generated immediate support. Now the room seemed hesitant. He ignored it and continued. As I was saying, all financing commitments are secured and fully guaranteed. Charles Bennett finally raised his hand. Actually, Richard, there may be something we should clarify. The room became still. Richard looked surprised. Charles almost never interrupted. There is nothing to clarify, Richard said. The funding package has already been finalized. Charles exchanged a glance with Susan. Has it? Richard stared at him. What exactly is that supposed to mean? Before Charles could answer, another notification appeared on multiple devices around the room. This time nobody bothered hiding their reactions. Phones were checked openly. Eyes widened. Whispers began circulating. Richard looked around in confusion. What is happening? No one answered immediately. Victoria remained silent. Her composure was becoming increasingly difficult to explain. Richard pointed toward her. You seem very relaxed for someone who has not contributed a single useful thing all afternoon. Victoria met his gaze. You never asked a useful question. The room froze. Several executives looked down at the table. Others stared openly. Richard laughed. Interesting. Then let me ask one now. Who exactly are you supposed to be? Victoria leaned back slightly. You invited me. Richard smirked. My assistant invites hundreds of people. Your assistant did not invite me. The answer landed differently than anyone expected. Richard's smile faded. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Across the room, Susan slowly pushed her chair back from the table. Richard, she said carefully, when was the last time you personally reviewed the final investor authorization list? This morning. Did you read all of it? Richard looked annoyed. Of course I did. Susan exchanged another glance with Charles. Neither believed him. Mark Holloway cleared his throat. Because according to the documents we just received, there is one approval signature attached to this entire transaction that matters more than any other. Richard laughed dismissively. And whose signature would that be? Nobody answered immediately. The silence stretched longer than it should have. One by one, eyes began turning toward Victoria Brooks. Richard followed their gaze. His expression hardened. Then he laughed again. This time nobody joined him. And for the first time since the meeting began, Richard Whitmore started to feel the slightest hint that something was very wrong. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Richard Whitmore looked around the boardroom, expecting someone to laugh, expecting someone to reassure him that whatever concern had suddenly appeared was exaggerated. Nobody did. Charles Bennett stared at the documents in front of him. Susan Crawford avoided eye contact altogether. Even the executives who had spent the afternoon supporting Richard seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Richard forced a smile. This is ridiculous, he said. Everyone is acting as if some mystery investor just walked into the room. Victoria Brooks calmly folded her hands. Perhaps that is because nobody bothered to ask who was sitting at the table. Richard leaned back in his chair. Then let us clear up the mystery. His voice carried the same arrogance that had dominated the meeting from the beginning. Tell us exactly why you are here. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. The question sounded far less confident than Richard intended. Victoria glanced toward the massive screen displaying Whitmore Holdings' expansion plans. I am here because this project requires authorization. Richard laughed. Authorization from whom? From the people financing it. The answer immediately drew attention from everyone in the room. Richard waved dismissively. The financing has already been approved. Has it? Victoria asked. The room became quiet again. Mark Holloway slowly opened the report in front of him. Richard, he said carefully, there is a section here I think you should review. Richard did not even look at the document. I already reviewed everything. Not this version. Richard finally accepted the folder and flipped through several pages. At first his expression remained unchanged. Then his eyes slowed. He turned back one page. Then another. The confidence on his face weakened slightly. Where did this come from? Charles answered. Outside counsel. Richard looked up. And why was it not included earlier? It was. Charles paused. You apparently skipped it. A few uncomfortable glances spread across the room. Richard continued reading. Several names appeared throughout the report. Investment entities, funding vehicles, strategic partnerships. None of that concerned him. Then he reached a page containing the final approval structure for the entire transaction. His eyes narrowed. For the first time all afternoon, he stopped speaking. Susan watched him carefully. You see it now. Richard looked back down at the page. This cannot be right. It is. There must be some mistake. Victoria remained silent. Richard looked directly at her. You expect me to believe this? Victoria answered calmly. Believe whatever you want. The response irritated him immediately. You think because your name appears on a document that suddenly makes you important? Several people visibly cringed. The remarks sounded worse than Richard realized. He continued anyway. This company was built through decades of work. Real work, not paperwork. Victoria nodded slowly. And yet today paperwork appears to be the only thing standing between success and disaster. No one laughed. Not a single person. Richard noticed. His irritation deepened. Enough games, he snapped. If you have something to say, say it. Victoria opened her portfolio. She removed a single sheet of paper and placed it on the table. No dramatic gesture. No speech. No performance. Just one page. Charles reached for it first. His eyes widened almost immediately. He passed it to Susan. Then to Mark. Each reaction mirrored the last. Richard grabbed the document from the table. The room watched him read. His face slowly lost color. The page contained a list of controlling entities connected to the funding package. Every path eventually led to the same place. The same signature authority. The same approval requirement. The same name. Victoria Brooks. Richard read the page again. Then a third time. The realization was beginning to settle over the room. The woman he had mocked. The woman he had publicly dismissed. The woman everyone had laughed at. She was connected to the very foundation supporting the largest deal in company history. And judging by the expressions around the table, that was only the beginning of what nobody knew. The boardroom felt different now. Not because anyone had spoken, but because nobody seemed certain what to say next. Richard Whitmore lowered the document onto the table and stared at Victoria Brooks as if the answer might somehow appear on her face. It did not. She remained composed, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, evening shadows stretched across the Chicago skyline. Inside, the confidence that had filled the room an hour earlier was quietly evaporating. Richard cleared his throat. This proves nothing. The statement sounded weaker than he intended. Charles Bennett leaned forward. Actually, it proves quite a lot. Richard ignored him. There are thousands of investors connected to large projects. Having your name attached to paperwork does not make you the decision maker. Victoria nodded slightly. That is true. Relief flashed across Richard's face for a moment. Then she continued. Fortunately, the paperwork includes more than my name. Several board members exchanged nervous glances. Susan Crawford opened another file on her tablet. Her eyes moved rapidly across the screen. The deeper she looked, the more concerned she became. Every new layer seemed connected to the last. Ownership structures, strategic funds, private investment vehicles, advisory boards. What initially appeared scattered and unrelated now formed a pattern. A very deliberate pattern. Mark Holloway rubbed his forehead. How did we miss this? Nobody answered. The question hung in the air. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Miss what? Susan looked up from her tablet. The concentration. What concentration? Control. The single word landed heavily. Richard frowned. Explain. Susan hesitated. Every major funding path eventually leads back to the same network. Richard folded his arms. And Charles answered this time. And the network appears to answer to Victoria. Silence followed. Richard laughed again, but the sound felt forced. That is impossible. Charles slid another report across the table. Then read it. Richard did not touch the document. He no longer seemed eager to review new information. Around the room, phones continued lighting up. More emails, more alerts, more messages from analysts, attorneys, and financial advisors who were apparently discovering the same thing at the same time. The timing alone unsettled people. Victoria glanced at her watch. The movement was small, almost insignificant, but Susan noticed. "Are we waiting for something?" she asked. Victoria met her gaze. "No, then why do I feel like something is about to happen?" Victoria smiled politely. "Because everyone in this room is finally paying attention." The answer sent another wave of discomfort through the board. Richard stood and walked toward the windows. He needed movement. He needed distance from the growing pressure around the table. Looking out over the city, he attempted to regain control of the meeting. "Let us stay focused on the transaction." Nobody responded. Richard turned back. The deal remained secure. More silence. The financing remained secure. Charles looked down at his phone. Another notification had arrived. This time his expression changed immediately. Susan received the same alert seconds later. Mark's phone vibrated next. Then Daniel Reeves. One by one, faces around the table shifted from concern to genuine alarm. Richard noticed. "What now?" Charles slowly lowered his phone. "The banks are asking questions." Richard stared at him. "Questions about what?" "About approval authority." Richard felt his stomach tighten. "Why?" Nobody answered immediately. Victoria simply reached into her portfolio and removed a thin folder. She placed it on the polished conference table and gently pushed it toward the center. No dramatic speech. No announcement. Just a folder. Every eye in the room locked onto it. Richard remained standing near the windows. For the first time all evening, he looked uncertain about approaching a document. Susan finally opened the folder. Her eyes widened almost instantly. Mark leaned closer. Daniel froze. Charles slowly exhaled. Richard could not see the contents from where he stood, but the reactions alone were enough to unsettle him. "What is it?" he demanded. Nobody answered right away. The silence lasted several seconds. Then Susan looked up at him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Richard, I think you need to sit down." Richard Whitmore slowly returned to his chair. The confidence that had once seemed effortless now appeared forced, held together by habit rather than certainty. Around him, the board members watched in silence as Susan Crawford turned the folder toward the center of the table. Inside were authorization documents, funding agreements, and governance provisions tied directly to the expansion project. Richard reached for the papers and began reading. The room remained quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of evening traffic far below the tower. As page after page passed beneath his eyes, a troubling pattern emerged. Every critical approval mechanism contained the same requirement. Every major funding release depended upon the same network of investment entities. Every pathway eventually connected to a single controlling authority. Victoria Brooks. Richard placed the papers down. "This does not mean you control the transaction." Victoria met his gaze calmly. "No. It means the transaction cannot move forward without my approval." The statement landed heavily across the room. Nobody laughed. Nobody challenged her. Several executives were already reviewing supporting documents on their tablets, searching for some overlooked detail that might change the conclusion. They found none. Charles Bennett leaned forward. "The legal structure is valid. We confirmed it with outside counsel less than an hour ago." Richard turned toward him. "Why am I hearing this now?" "Because nobody expected it," Charles answered honestly. "The ownership layers were intentionally structured through multiple investment vehicles. Everything was disclosed. We simply never followed the chain far enough." Richard shook his head. "That is impossible." "No," Susan said quietly. "It is thorough." The distinction mattered. Victoria had not hidden anything. The information had always existed. The board simply assumed they already knew who held power. That assumption now looked expensive. Richard glanced toward the giant presentation screen still displaying projections for future revenue. Numbers that had seemed inevitable earlier now felt fragile. "How much influence are we actually talking about?" he asked. Mark Holloway answered before anyone else could. "Enough that several banks have already contacted us requesting clarification." Richard frowned. Clarification about what? Whether final authorization has been secured. The room grew even quieter. Another phone vibrated. Then another. Several board members checked incoming messages simultaneously. Market analysts were asking questions. Legal teams were requesting updates. Financial partners wanted confirmation. The uncertainty was beginning to spread beyond the walls of the boardroom. Victoria remained completely composed. She had not raised her voice once. She had not argued. She had not defended herself against the insults from earlier. Instead, she had simply allowed the facts to arrive one document at a time. Richard stared at her. "Why did you not explain any of this when you walked in?" Victoria tilted her head slightly. "You never asked." A few people lowered their eyes. The answer was impossible to dispute. Richard remembered the handshake he had refused. The comments. The laughter. The assumptions. None of it looked wise now. Yet pride remained stronger than caution. "Even if all of this is true," he said, "the project still benefits everyone involved." Victoria nodded. "Potentially. Then there is no reason for concern." For the first time that evening, Victoria smiled. Not a mocking smile. Not an angry one. A patient smile. That depends on whether the people involved can be trusted. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard immediately understood the implication. "You are making this personal." "No," Victoria replied. "I am evaluating risk." The distinction struck the room harder than any accusation could have. Investors evaluated risk. Boards evaluated risk. Every major decision in the building existed because someone had assessed risk. Suddenly, the discussion was no longer about money alone. It was about judgment, character, leadership, and for the first time all evening, Richard realized the transaction itself might not be the most important decision waiting to be made. Because while everyone else had been focused on securing approval for a $12 billion expansion, Victoria Brooks appeared to be deciding whether Whitmore Holdings deserved it at all. No one spoke for several seconds after Victoria's last statement. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was revealing. Every person around the table seemed to be re-evaluating the events of the afternoon through a completely different lens. Richard Whitmore remained seated, but the certainty that had defined him for hours was fading rapidly. He looked toward the board members who had supported him earlier. None of them seemed eager to meet his eyes. Outside, the city lights had begun illuminating the skyline, transforming the windows into mirrors that reflected the room back at itself. What had started as a celebration of corporate power now felt more like an audit of judgment. Susan Crawford slowly closed her tablet. "I reviewed the latest authorization structure again," she said. "There is no ambiguity." Charles Bennett nodded. "The same conclusion came from legal." Mark Holloway added. "And from compliance." Richard exhaled sharply. "You are all acting as if one investor suddenly controls everything." Victoria looked at him calmly. "Not everything." Richard immediately seized on the answer. "Then we are wasting time." "Not everything," Victoria repeated. "Only the parts that matter." The room fell silent again. Several executives shifted in their seats. The distinction carried more weight than anyone wanted to admit. Richard rubbed his temple. "Explain exactly what that means." Victoria opened another document and slid it across the table. "The expansion requires 3 categories of approval." Richard glanced at the page. "I know how the deal works." "Then you know what happens if even one category is withheld." His jaw tightened. He did know. Everyone in the room knew. The structure had been designed to protect investors against unnecessary risk. At the time, it had seemed like smart governance. Now it felt like a trap. Charles adjusted his glasses. "The first category remains approved." Susan nodded. "The second category remains approved." Mark looked toward Victoria. "The third category requires final confirmation." Richard stared at the table. For the first time all evening, nobody needed to explain what that meant. Victoria was not merely connected to the project. She represented the final gate through which the entire transaction had to pass. Every billion-dollar projection on the screen behind them depended on that single decision. Richard slowly leaned back. "Why?" The question surprised everyone. It sounded genuine. Victoria answered without hesitation. "Because my partners insisted on accountability." "Your partners?" Richard asked. "The people whose capital built the financing package." Susan looked toward Victoria. "How much capital are we actually discussing?" Victoria considered the question for a moment. "Enough to matter." Several people exchanged nervous looks. That answer was not reassuring. Charles checked another message arriving on his phone. His expression changed instantly. "There is more." Richard looked up. "More what?" Charles swallowed. "The investors are requesting a conference call. Tonight. Immediately." Richard frowned. Why? Nobody answered right away. Victoria already knew. Susan seemed to realize it next. Mark looked down at his tablet and quietly muttered something under his breath. Richard's frustration returned. Can somebody tell me what is happening? Charles slowly turned his screen around. An email sat at the top of the page. It had been sent less than 3 minutes earlier by one of the largest institutional partners involved in the project. Richard read the first sentence, then the second. His expression darkened. The message was polite, professional, direct. It requested confirmation that Victoria Brooks continued to support the transaction before any further action would proceed. Richard read the email again, then once more. Around the table, nobody said a word. Nobody needed to. The message accomplished what hours of discussion had not. It removed every remaining doubt. The investors already knew who held influence. The banks knew. Legal counsel knew. Compliance knew. The only person who seemed surprised was Richard Whitmore. Victoria gathered her documents and closed her portfolio. The soft click echoed through the room. Every eye turned toward her. Richard finally looked up from the email. You knew this was coming. Victoria met his gaze. Yes. And you said nothing. You never asked. Richard lowered his eyes. Across the room, another notification appeared on several devices at exactly the same moment. This time the reactions were immediate. Faces went pale. Chairs shifted. Susan looked at Charles. Charles looked at Mark. And before anyone could speak, Victoria quietly said the words that made the entire boardroom tense. It seems the investors have started reviewing today's meeting notes. The temperature inside the boardroom seemed to drop even though nothing about the building had changed. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls, but nobody was looking at the skyline anymore. Every eye remained fixed on phones, tablets, and laptops as new messages continued arriving. Richard Whitmore stared across the table at Victoria Brooks, searching for some sign that he still understood the situation. He found none. She remained calm, composed, and completely unshaken by the tension spreading through the room. Susan Crawford opened the newest email. Her expression tightened immediately. This is not good, she said quietly. Charles Bennett leaned closer. What happened? Susan turned her screen toward him. Several board members followed the exchange. The message came from a consortium representing multiple institutional investors. The wording was professional, but the meaning was impossible to miss. They were requesting a formal review of governance procedures surrounding the expansion project. More importantly, they were requesting details regarding conduct during today's meeting. Richard immediately frowned. Conduct? Susan nodded slowly. Apparently, someone submitted meeting observations. Richard looked around the room. Submitted them to whom? Nobody answered. The silence itself felt like an answer. Large investors often had representatives. Representatives often took notes. Notes often traveled much farther than executives expected. Mark Holloway checked another alert. It is spreading. Richard's jaw tightened. What is spreading? Questions. Mark looked up from his screen. A lot of questions. Victoria remained silent. She did not need to say anything. The facts were beginning to move on their own. Charles received another notification. This time he read it aloud. Multiple funding partners are requesting confirmation that leadership decisions align with corporate governance standards and investor expectations. The room grew even quieter. Richard stood up. This is absurd. We are discussing paperwork while a $12 billion expansion is sitting on the table. Victoria finally spoke. No, Richard turned toward her. No. You think this is about paperwork? Her voice remained calm. It is about trust. Several board members lowered their eyes. Earlier that afternoon, they had laughed. They had watched. They had allowed assumptions to guide their behavior. Now those moments felt far more expensive than anyone expected. Richard tried another approach. Let us be practical. The project benefits everyone involved. Potentially, Victoria replied. You keep saying that. Because outcomes depend on decisions. Richard spread his hands. Then let us make the decision. Victoria looked at him for several seconds before answering. That is exactly what I am doing. The statement landed heavily across the room. For the first time all evening, nobody seemed confused about who possessed leverage. Susan closed her laptop and leaned back. Richard, there is something else. He looked exhausted now. What? The investors already scheduled the conference call. Richard blinked. Without consulting us. Charles nodded. The call starts in 30 minutes. Richard stared at him. 30 minutes? Yes. Who requested it? Susan looked toward Victoria. Her partners. Another silence followed. Richard slowly sat back down. He was beginning to realize how much of the situation had developed beyond his control. Every new update revealed another layer of influence he never knew existed. Every document seemed connected to a network larger than he imagined. Victoria reached into her portfolio one final time. This time she removed a thin black folder stamped with the logo of a private investment consortium few people in the room had ever seen. Charles immediately recognized it. So did Susan. Their reactions were enough to alarm everyone else. Richard noticed instantly. What is that? Victoria placed the folder in the center of the table. The complete funding structure. Richard stared at it. We already reviewed the funding structure. Victoria shook her head. No, her eyes met his. You reviewed the version you thought mattered. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room felt frozen. Slowly, Charles opened the folder. The first page appeared. His eyes widened immediately. Susan leaned closer. Mark nearly stood from his chair. Richard could see the shock spreading across their faces, but he still could not see the document itself. Finally, Susan looked up. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Richard. He swallowed. What now? Susan held up the first page. The amount is 3 times larger than we thought. Richard Whitmore grabbed the folder and pulled it closer. For several seconds, he simply stared at the numbers, convinced he was misreading them. Then he turned the page. And another. And another. Each document led to the same conclusion. The funding structure was far larger than anyone on the board had understood. What they had assumed was a major investment turned out to be the foundation supporting nearly every critical layer of the expansion. The room remained silent as Richard finished reading. Slowly, he looked up at Victoria Brooks. For the first time all evening, there was no arrogance in his expression. Only disbelief. $3 billion, he said quietly. Nobody corrected him. Nobody needed to. The numbers sat heavily over the boardroom. Charles Bennett folded his hands together. Directly and indirectly controlled through multiple entities. Susan Crawford nodded. Every verification report confirms it. Mark Holloway looked down at the documents again. Without those commitments, the entire financing structure changes. Richard turned toward Victoria. You own all of this. Victoria answered calmly. My consortium manages it. You never disclosed that. Several board members immediately looked uncomfortable. Victoria's eyes remained fixed on Richard. Every disclosure was submitted months ago. Nobody challenged her, because everyone now knew she was right. The information had existed from the beginning. The board had simply failed to recognize its significance. Richard lowered his eyes. Earlier that afternoon, he had assumed she was irrelevant. Now, every major institution involved in the transaction appeared to know her name. Every investor, every attorney, every compliance officer, every funding partner. The realization was devastating. Susan's phone vibrated again. She opened the message and exhaled slowly. The conference call has been moved up. Richard looked at her. Why? Because they want answers tonight. Charles checked his own phone, and they are asking specifically about governance concerns. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Outside, Chicago's skyline glowed beneath the darkening sky. Inside, the atmosphere felt completely different from the one that existed only hours earlier. Victoria calmly closed the black folder. I believe you have everything you need. Richard stared at her. Everything except your decision. Victoria nodded. That is correct. Richard stood and walked around the table. The movement surprised everyone. Earlier, he had dominated the room. Now he looked like a man trying to catch up with events moving faster than he could control. He stopped several feet from Victoria. What exactly are you evaluating? Victoria answered immediately. Leadership. The word landed harder than anyone expected. Richard glanced toward the board. Nobody rushed to defend him. Nobody volunteered support. In fact, several members appeared unwilling to make eye contact. Victoria continued. Investment decisions are not only about numbers. The room listened carefully. They are about judgment, character, accountability, the people entrusted with responsibility. Richard swallowed. And you think I failed that test? Victoria did not answer right away. The silence itself felt like an answer. Finally, she spoke. I think today's meeting provided useful information. Several board members lowered their eyes. Richard remembered every comment he had made, every assumption, every laugh that followed, every opportunity he had ignored. What seemed harmless earlier now looked reckless. Susan cleared her throat. Victoria. Victoria turned toward her. Yes. What happens if support is withdrawn? Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Victoria looked around the room. The transaction would need to be restructured. Charles answered before anyone else could, which could take months. Mark added quietly, possibly longer. Richard slowly returned to his chair. The implications were impossible to ignore. Delays, uncertainty, investor concerns, market reactions, questions from analysts, questions from shareholders, questions from the media. Everything suddenly felt fragile. Another notification appeared on several screens at once. Susan opened hers immediately. Charles did the same. Mark's expression darkened. Richard looked at them. Now what? Charles slowly lowered his phone. His voice was barely above a whisper. The investors are not waiting for tomorrow. Richard felt his stomach tighten. What do they want? Charles looked directly at him. Then toward Victoria. Finally back at the screen. They want to know whether she still intends to stand behind the company.